thank you all very much for coming. And welcome to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. My name is Carl Stitchin, and I'm the director of the Institute. And I'm really pleased that we are here tonight for a relaunch, I think is how I'll describe it, of the Judicial Conversations series. This series launched very successfully shortly before the pandemic as an in-person event, jointly badged by the Institute and our Society of Advanced Legal Scholars, SALS, which is our friends group at the Institute. And then we had a pandemic, and now we are returning with the Judicial Conversations series. And I'm really grateful to the series organizer, Les Moran, one of our senior associate research fellows, who has stayed with us and is been organizing not just this event, but there are plans for many more judicial conversations. And so we're very pleased that Les has stayed with us with the series. And that's all I have by way of introduction, except to say reception will follow next door after this event, so please do stay and have a drink with us. So I'll now turn it over to Les, who will introduce tonight's event. So
thank you very much, Carl. Yes, thank you, Carl, and thanks to the Institute for providing this space and this platform for, as Carl has explained, Judicial Conversations. Judicial Conversations is an initiative that I developed a number of years ago when I was at Birkbeck as a professor in the law school there, and it was designed to encourage debate and research on the judiciary. And tonight's event, I think, fits the bill 200% in terms of that agenda, because when I came across the report that Keir Monteith was involved in producing with colleagues at Manchester University, the project to look at racial bias in the judiciary and on the bench struck me as being, and he makes this point, if they make this point in the report, an area of debate that needs to be urgently addressed, and had not attracted perhaps the same amount of attention as other aspects of diversity in the judiciary and the way prejudice works in and through the justice institutions. So it's a great pleasure to welcome and to introduce you to Keir Monteith, who's a King's Counsel. He's a leading silk with an established reputation, representing clients charged with the most serious criminal offences. It was wonderful that he was able to come to the Institute. He's involved in a case at the Old Bailey at present, so he's had a tough day.
Which we can't talk about.
No, and is ready for a tough evening. He's a member of the Garden Court Chambers. He's a training tutor for the Judicial College and a part-time judge. In 2021, he was appointed as a Simon Fellow at the University of Manchester. And this report, Racial Bias and the Bench, is the product of that fellowship. He worked with a number of academics. The lead academic was Professor Quinn on this piece of research, both an empirical study and a library-based study looking at issues around racial bias and the bench, which was published in 2022. I'm also delighted to introduce Erica Rattley, who is a professor of law at the University of Kent. Erica has an international reputation for research and many publications on gender and the justice system, and is a leading scholar in particular around judicial diversity and judicial appointments. She played a key role in an amazing project called the Feminist Judgments Project, which, working with other colleagues, was an attempt to think about how judges write judgments, and through that process embed prejudices, institutional prejudices, in the way they think and in the way they arrive at conclusions. I wanted to invite Erica to join Keith and myself in the conversation tonight because I think there are some amazing synergies, connections, as well as differences between issues around racial bias and gender bias or misogyny in the institution of the judiciary. That's not to say there aren't other structures of prejudice. working through the judiciary. And one of the topics that I want us to discuss in the conversation is it's inevitable that structures of bias are deeply embedded in our institutions. I'm certainly an advocate of the idea that we don't live in a society where you can avoid prejudice in all its multiple dimensions. And I think that is a major challenge for us in thinking about how to address that and to move towards a more just society. So with all those points in mind, I'm going to move to my first question to Keir. And the structure is going to be a series of questions. I'll begin with some specific questions for Keir, then I want to draw Erica into the debate. We'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then hopefully there will be an opportunity for us to have questions and conversation before we retire to have some refreshments, which will be yet another opportunity for conversation. So Keir, I'd like to begin by a very open question to ask you what inspired this project.
Well, yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to come along and to have a chat about this important topic, so thank you very much indeed. What inspired me? I'm not sure that there's anything necessarily inspired me, it's just more I was upset. I mean, I've been in the job for about 30 years. I used to have hair. The olden day has all been taken out of me, and we'd had the Black Lives Matter protest, and so that brings the issue of racism to the fore. And I think I just lifted my head up and I looked at where I was working and realised, maybe I'd realised it a long time ago, that nothing much had changed. And if anything, it got worse in crime. I work in crime. And how could that be? How could that be the situation? And I just looked into it a little bit more, that I could go into a courtroom and see that that was the case. Every time I went to the Court of Appeal, there were no black judges, literally no black judges in the Court of Appeal. Supreme Court, no black judges, ever. Still aren't. And it's got, well, Eric can talk about this, I'm sure, in more detail, worse for women now than it has been for a very long time. And this opportunity came up with Professor Quinn at Manchester University, and I sort of leapt the chance to see if I could do something in terms of the debate about this issue. And then it got worse, because there was a strategy that started in 2020. It was launched by the Lord Chief Justice to increase diversity and inclusion, which is brilliant. Of course, that should happen. But you look it up online, look at that document about diversity, the word racism isn't mentioned. Literally isn't mentioned. And how one could embark upon a process to try and increase diversity without confronting the issue of racism, I sort of don't know. And it's hard to understand and comprehend. And even now, after our report, in the update, so it's 2 years on since that report, again, you can Google it and find it online, it still isn't mentioned. So, yeah, I'm not sure that there was an inspiration, it was more a frustration and an upset that in a profession that prides itself in being highly intellectual and being able to talk about the untalkable, it wasn't dealing with this problem. So that led on to the work of the report.
Well, I think frustration is a great motivator. So it sounds like...
Yeah, but it can be very frustrating.
Can be demoralising at the same time, definitely. The report has three main sections. The first section, which seems to be the part that draws most exclusively on the new empirical data, looks at racial bias in the operation of the courts and tribunals. And then there's the part two, which looks at issues around judicial bias training and education, and the third part focuses on judicial appointments and the diversity debates and the appointments process. Perhaps we could start by focusing on the first part. And the reason for suggesting that is that's one of the areas where there has been a longer tradition of scholarship that's identified the outcome of prejudice working through the court system. For example, with disproportionate sentencing, or the experience of black and minority ethnic individual in the courtroom process. And I wondered if you have been able to identify different things or new developments. You were just mentioning the fact that it seems to be getting worse. So is that something that came out of the empirical study?
I think, unfortunately, I'm laughing, but it's not funny, is it? Each report would say that. If you go back 30 years, or 40 years, or 50 years, in fact, Justice goes back 50 years in the report saying you need to change the structure. Each time they look at the situation, it's got worse. Their last report in 2020 was, you've not done what we asked you to consider 2 years ago. It's getting worse. And it is, in my view, getting worse. But one of the things I think our report, in terms of new research or new things to consider, is it deals with judges. And incredibly in this country, and that's why I encourage all you academics out there to cite our report and continue the investigation. They don't seem to be placed under the same scrutiny as they have been, quite rightly, in other countries. And that needs to be done. Judges, I include myself in this, wield incredible power. I can lock you up, I can take away your liberty, or you can be set free. And if I have a bias, we all, as you say in the introduction, we all have bias, and if it does operate in an unfair way, and that needs to be checked in a justice system, and it's not being done. And another aspect of our report, which I think stands out, is that we asked legal workers, we asked a number of judges as well, because like me, you can be a judge and also a barrister, whether racial bias had an impact on the processes or the outcomes of the justice system. And in answer to that question, 95% of people said yes. And if we had enough time, I'd pause for a minute, because that's what you do as a barrister, for that to sink in. 95% of people are saying racial bias has an impact in terms of the process or the outcome of the justice system. And that is a terrible figure. A terrible figure. And you go through our report, it comes down a little bit for significant impact. But I'd have to refer to the exact figures. But that's there as a big issue in terms of the outcome of decisions. Right across the board. So it's not just crime, the whole part of the justice system. So it's an exploration which I don't think really has happened before into the judiciary and into the processes of the justice system, and it's acutely worrying.
I think that's a neat point to draw Erica in.
Yeah, I've done enough talking.
No. That's providing that neat segue.
Yes.
Perfect. To ask you, Erica, just to, what do you think is it a similar position with regard to gender?
Yeah, well, I'd like to pick up from where you are. So first of all, because I've not yet spoken, I need to say thank you for having me. But I think what this report does so well is it takes a holistic approach and it looks at all aspects of the justice system. And so there have been, as Keir says, there's been many reports, and I recently did a tally, and since 2006, which is when the Judicial Appointments Commission started work, there's been around 30 or so reports which have in some way said there's not enough judicial diversity, these are the barriers, and this is how we might get it. So we're not in a position where we don't that people don't know about this and we haven't thought about how to do it better, but we're in a position of glacial progress and stagnation. And actually, in a way, the debates have become sort of inert because by the familiarity, we know it. So why do we still need to talk about it? And I think what this report does is remind us of what I would argue being kind of the most important, and I will get to gender because it relates to gender, but the most important reason for why we need diversity, which is it makes a difference who the judge is when they hear a case. Who the judge is matters. And that is an essential part. And so if we want our judiciary to be the best it can be, and we want them to make the best decisions, then it matters who the judges are, because we know that a diverse body of individuals will work better together. They come to stronger decisions, that they are able, and this comes out in the report, you're able to challenge prejudice and bias, whether it appears in the courtroom, whether it appears at lunch, because there's a bit in the report where they talk about comments being made at lunch, and that's something that Lady Hale has spoken about, how as a woman judge, it was really important that she was able to sit at a table as an equal to her male colleagues and be able to challenge just everyday assumptions, common sense understandings that they had about the world. And so I think what we're looking at, and what the bubble we need to burst, is that actually, one of the ways in which this debate is often framed is that the judiciary is good, but it could just be better. So all things being equal, it would be better if it was a bit more diverse. But what we need to when will we recognise that we have an awful lot of evidence which is showing us it's not great, it's not even good, it's poor that these things are happening, and actually one of the solutions lies in who the judges are. So I think that's one of the things where, when we think about gender, that's where those arguments have been made. And the Feminist Judgments Project was designed to be able to not simply look from the outside and say, look, you could do better, this judgment could have been different, but was to actually engage in a academic storytelling of rewriting those judgments, going, here, look, this is how this judgment could have been written, this is a different way in which the story could have been told, a different way to which you could have reasoned, a different way in which you could come to. And one of the things about the Feminist Judgments Project, which was really important, was the decisions were sometimes the same. Like sometimes, we inevitably had to come to the same, but the reasoning was different, how you came to that decision, what you did in that judgment, and so it designed as a practical demonstration of the importance of diversity and the importance of who's around the table and who's in the room. So I'll stop now so you can do another.
No, but that's a really interesting point and an interesting connection that I made as I was reading the report on racial bias, the way in which the stories that are told in the courts, both by legal professionals as well as members of the bench, frames the understanding. And it reminded me very much of the Wildblood case, which is a case from the 1950s about men who are having sex with men. And Peter Wildblood, in his memoir about the case, talks about the way in which he was involved in a party with men who were having sex with each other. It was a fairly mundane event, but the way it was described in the court and in the media made it into this sensational champagne and caviar event. And he said it was nothing like that, but the rewriting of it was making it sensational and othering those who were accused of the crime. And I think, Keir, you talk about this process of othering that goes on through the justice system. So that was a really interesting connection. I think the Feminist Judgment Project is a wonderful initiative to really dig deep into the structures of understanding that have prejudice embedded in them, and show that that is not the only way of imagining the world. Even within the existing legal framework, you can decide differently to promote a better idea of justice.
And I think that goes to the other difficulty that remains, is that we live in a kind of enter a new closed world where we all know that judges have prejudice and bias, but we don't really want to think that they have prejudice and bias. And so that's a tricky kind of thing to get your head around. And in fact, we just need to accept, as Keir said, judges have prejudice and bias. Now, where are we going to go from there? It's not about a blank slate. It's about an open mind. It's, that's Claire Dubé said that over a decade ago, that this is what judging is about. So it's yeah.
But again, I think that's a really neat connection to my next question, which is about training and education, because I think this report has a potential to introduce a sea change in terms of the way we think about the point of departure for judicial education. And the starting point, as I think Erica was just mentioning there, is to take prejudice as the given. And if we're all prejudiced, we then need to have to deal with it. Or there's a particular way of describing it in Keir's report that he talks about the need to put whiteness on the agenda. And again, I was reminded of some queer scholarship which talked about heteronormativity. How do you get people to problematize the norm? Because the norm is like the air we breathe. We're not conscious of its constituent parts as we're breathing it. We're not conscious of the corrupting elements in the air as we're breathing it. So how do you disrupt that embedded, almost unconscious experience of racial bias or heteronormativity, which produces homophobia or misogyny that is part of our everyday experience?
Part of it is this, isn't it? Part of it is having these discussions and people having the confidence later on in this room talking about it, out of this room, in your own workplaces, with your families and friends, talking about it directly. And we need more of this, because from the point of view of our report, our first recommendation is so easy but so difficult, because it costs nothing, which is like manna to heaven for those at the top. And we ask, in the context of training, which was what your question was about, that those at the top publicly and sincerely, although I'm not sure that's in the report, but it has to be sincerely acknowledge the existence of institutional racism in the justice system. And if that was said with feeling, if it was said publicly, joined up, we would say, with everything else that we recommend, that in real life, just join it up with some stuff, some actions, including training, then there would be the potential, it can't be guaranteed, but there would be the potential for a significant cultural shift in the justice system, and a recognition, along with the other biases that are there, that we need help to change. And then when you get some training, then hopefully it's been devised, it's bespoke training, it starts off on that acknowledgement of bias, and from where we're coming from, institutional racism. And then one would hope you have a better understanding about what the problem is, the air that we're all breathing, the pollution within it, the contaminants within it. And the discussion amongst the judges, I would hope, will be open and frank, recognising the issues and then starting ongoing work, because what is clear, you can't just go off to one training session, tick all the boxes, and then you suddenly become neutral. It's probably lifelong work with ongoing acknowledgement from those right at the top of what the problem actually is. I'm not sure it would ever eradicate bias, but it would be checked. You'd be, hopefully, a lot more aware. And like many professions, judges get together if there's a difficult problem and have a chat. And I'd hope in that chat you'd now have, if we had this change, at least one or two going, well, hang on a minute, you can't, that's wrong. You can't do that, there's a major problem. And then you have a proper legal discussion, rather than this institutional approach, which generally replicates itself year after year, decade after decade. And I hope it happens. Some other institutions seem to be a lot more progressive.
Well, it was an interesting juxtaposition. At one point in the report, you quote Aaron Kondnani, who talks about race training as the graveyard of struggle. And that's certainly something I've experienced on college equality and diversity committees. You sort of feel as if you're Sisyphus pushing the ball up the hill, and it's constantly rolling back, making no progress at all. Even amongst people who you think would be, enthusiastic about social justice through institutional change. And the other quote, I think, that comes at the end of that section on education comes from Angela Davis, where she says it's not enough to be non-racist, but you must be anti-racist.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to make a connection there to Erica, because you've done work on the way you frame the interventions around prejudice and anti-discrimination, for example, in terms of thinking about the role of feminism. Judges should be feminist, and I think people, certainly when I've been teaching that, students have gasped, isn't that judges being prejudiced? Surely they can't be feminists.
Yes, and you don't need to take my word for it. This was something that Lady Hale said back in 2008 when she's quite openly, and it was a conversation she was having with Lord Bingham, when they were talking about judges being activists and whether judges should acknowledge. And of course it was, Lady Hale arrived on the bench, people knowing what she'd done before the bench, which isn't always the case in relation to sort of our senior judiciary. And she makes the point, if feminism is about equality of the sexes, well, and that's a good thing, then why wouldn't we want judges to be starting from that basis? And I would make the same about being anti-racist. It's, and I think this is part of what, again, going back to the point of recognising the judges on a sort of empty conduit, is this Herculean idea that the law just comes through them and is untainted by the mouthpiece through which it comes. No, all judges are shaped by their experiences and preferences and identity characteristics and so on, and that is good. Hence the argument for diversity. And I think one of the things that feminist scholars wrote around the sort of late 90s, there was a lot of discussion about the difference between good bias and bad bias, and the idea that bias doesn't disappear, but actually we just need to recognise it's there, and that good bias is bias that leads us to truth, and bad bias is bias that doesn't lead us to truth. And so, again, that's sort of part of a reframing of it, to sort of say, let's not try and get rid of something we know we can't get rid of, but instead let's accept it, but accept that within that there are better and worse ways of doing this, which.
But I think I don't know if it's interesting, but going back to being frustrating or upsetting part is the institution has an impact on this. I can obviously speak from my own experience, but it's also in the report as well. Becoming a judge, I think, does something to you, right? And has an impact upon you. And that can, I think, be conscious and maybe more importantly subconscious. So imagine if you're sitting in court and everybody addresses you as Your Honour. That has an impact. It certainly does to me. I change. Sorry about that, everybody. But it's inevitable, isn't it? I'm not down here. I'm up there. You lot be down here. I'm raised up. When I come through the door's opened, etc., etc. So the institution does something, and maybe it takes some of the good bias away, and maybe it increases some of the bad bias, or maybe your ability to change is diminished because you're not allowed to flourish. And coming back to where we started, when there is a diversity and inclusion strategy, the institution is such that it believes it isn't racist. So the word isn't discussed. The problem isn't recognised. Same issues over gender. And that's incredible. And the survey says 95% of the processes in the system have this bias. So I think the institutional part is important over and beyond our own individual bias.
And I think that I would agree with that, and I think that's why again this report is really useful in shifting the focus away from what might be described as a deficit model, where you're looking on what the people who aren't there haven't got in why they're not, to actually to looking at the institution and putting the spotlight on that. So the question is not how can we help underrepresented candidates become judges, which is the sort of framing of the debate often, but is instead what can we do about the institution for it to recognise its own failings and to become stronger and better in what it really is, which I think is.
Well, and you know, another thing we're saying it, you know, we aren't saying that the absolute solution is more black and brown judges. That I can say that now. I don't think that would be the solution. The institution needs changing to bring about real justice. Otherwise, it will just repeat. People will say, look at the representation. But sadly, my belief is, ultimately, it won't have changed.
And which I agree with Leslie. Because both we know that representation can come and go. We just need to use the example of the Supreme Court where, you know, the Housing days of 2018 to 2020 where we had 3 women and, you know, it was there, and then we're back to the one with Lady Rose now. So if this is played in terms of representation, it's the gains are so easily lost. And I remember being asked back in 2010, you know, is there now a constitutional principle where there should only, you know, there must be a woman on the Supreme Court? And I was like, you're kidding me? Like one? Like, and that was the day where you sort of thought it's gonna, of course, you know, there's going to be many more women, and then I'm still 13 years later. There's one woman on that Supreme Court, and that's where, you know, where gains have been made. And of course, it's very clear that the Supreme Court is undiverse in many ways.
Well, that brings us neatly to the third area of the report, which is around judicial appointments. And I was looking at the most recent report, the 2022 statistics, and it makes depressing reading, certainly around race and ethnicity, where it seems to be getting worse, particularly for black applicants. And also, you know, one of the issues that I think we ought to touch on is the question of intersectionality. So looking at the experience of black women or women from black and ethnic minorities, solicitors, women solicitors who apply for the judicial appointments, you know, the chances of them getting through to the appointment are very slim indeed.
Yeah, but that's the point, you know, as per the introduction, it's just how on earth are we still in this situation? And it becomes clear that new strategies, etc., aren't the solution, because that was the conversation that people were having 10 years ago. There was some initiative then, 15 years ago there was an initiative then, and stuff hasn't changed. And as you say, Les, in many respects it's got worse. And intersectionality, again, I think we mentioned it in our report, it's almost not worth applying to become a judge if you're a black female solicitor on the stats. I mean, of course you should, oh my God, and definitely encourage, but if you, and don't look at the figures, is what I would say, make the applications. And it's been recognised not only in our report, but by the last president of the Law Society. You know, the pool of applicants actually is significant. And I can tell you, brilliant people out there, fantastic people out there, who should be sitting on the bench and aren't getting through. And why aren't they getting through? And the figures, the statistics, our report, other people's report, and the answer is institutional racism. That's it. But no one at the top would want to accept that. And again, that's a sadness, because if it was accepted, then something would be done. We joined Stephanie Boyce. It was the fourth or fifth recommendation. The whole process needs to be overhauled. One needs to get rid of the JAC and start again. That's it.
Which is, you made a point that I would make too, that for me, for too long we've been, so if, you all know this, there's three classic arguments being made for why we should have judicial diversity. It's equality of opportunity, democratic legitimacy in the context of the institution, and then because it would be a better, stronger judiciary equality type argument. And for too long, the argument have been directed towards process and how people get into an institution. And the trouble is, if actually there isn't any political leadership or will to really do something about that, then it enables you to look like you're doing an awful lot in terms of changing the processes, which is exactly what happened when we got the JSC in 2006, without actually really recognising that you really want it, because you accept the argument that this is a good thing, because you on merit, basically, that diversity and merit go hand in hand into a better judiciary. So it allows people to look busy, to make changes in terms of the process, but actually not changing. And the history tells us that political will is vital to this. We saw this in Canada when the Canadian politicians, Justice decided, I want to have more women, and he got more women. He did it. He changed how many women there were on the judiciary because he was able to lead it. And we're now in an unfortunate position where we're not able to do that because the system wasn't working prior to the JSC. We wrestled the judicial appointments away from the politicians who have the accountability, and is now in a body which is much less accountable. And for years has been able to say what you're alluding to here, going, well, it's not our fault, it's just because there's not enough people in the pool. And so there was this kind of shifting of blame that was going on. And we're 2 decades later, there are enough people in the pool. We know this, and somehow, and we have statistical evidence that the processes aren't working here. That there's a blockage, and so I think that what that does for me is it amplifies the absence of actual political will for wanting to make a difference, and that's what needs to be. People need to be embarrassed about that, and that's a sort of way of affecting change. Because I was interested in your report, and I think I understand the answer.
You got the answer?
No, I haven't got the answer at all. I haven't got any answers. No, I haven't got any answers.
Question.
Sorry, no, I haven't got any answers. But I think I might have the. When you were talking about representation, because it was interesting that there was no mention of quotas or targets and was that deliberate? Because it wasn't about numbers, it's about institutional change. Is that why you did that?
I think that there is a bit of a reference there, which borrows one of Justice.
So yes, that's true. Sorry.
Yeah, one of their recommendations that you need a critical mass of judges, and in their own report they go on to explain why that's not really a quota. But whatever you want to describe it as, you do need a critical mass, because it can be, well, it's quite an individualistic existence, and the occasions when maybe judges do get together, you need to be able to have the confidence to voice your own opinions, or to stand up to stuff. And if there's only one of you or two of you, it isn't going to happen, I'll tell you now. You need a critical mass in this particular topic of black and brown judges. And intersectionality, also very important in terms of gender and class as well, because, well, that's a whole another big topic, isn't it? And there's an absence of that in the judiciary. So going back to the question, recruitment, we need to start again in terms of recruitment. And in the context certainly of our report, with an eye on having that critical mass of diversity.
Before I throw it open to questions from you, I just wanted to pick up on a word that you used earlier, which is about confidence. And I think that's a really interesting one because I can see there's a real complex dynamics in confidence. Because on the one hand, I think you're right to say that confidence is important, central in fact, and it ties in, I think, quite neatly with this idea of political will. Because I have a sense that, picking up on a point that Erica made, that you can have what appear to be very good systems that will provide opportunities for change, but they also provide opportunities for inertia, to reproduce the status quo, even though you're presenting that process of reproducing the status quo through a different regime, which seeks to give it greater legitimacy. So I think political will and confidence go together. It's a confidence to have the political will, so when it comes to taking a decision, you decide otherwise, and open up opportunities for people that are otherwise denied. But at the same time, going back to the point that you made about the judge sitting above the others in the courtroom, dressed in peculiar gear, speaking strange tones, that gives them a different type of confidence. And I think there's a really interesting tension between the confidence to say that we are prejudiced, we are a machinery that reproduces structures of prejudice, at the same time as they're embedded in that structure in a very elite position. And I suppose that's a conundrum at the heart of change. How do you get, which I think was what the point you were touching on, how do you get people into a position where they have the confidence to think otherwise at the same time as being in this elite position, where they're expected to sort of almost reproduce the status quo. And that could be a scary position to be in.
Yeah. Well, it is.
Mm.
I agree.
But I think it also goes to the work that's being done around sort of understanding. So you mentioned it earlier on, this sort of the mystique around the role of the judge, is as if the job of being a judge is somehow different to other jobs. And I think there's been a growing conversations around sort of judicial well-being and ideas of understanding that judging requires the judge to do just actually very, very hard things and to encounter difficult facts. And part of what when you're talking about sort of the garb that they put on, and I'm not talking about literally, but just in terms of the sort of sitting as a judge, that there's a sort of, there is, to allow the judge to be seen as vulnerable is actually really important, and letting people know that vulnerability is okay without us thinking, no, we want our judges to not to be vulnerable because of what we're asking them to do. So I think some of the work that's being done around that, of looking at the sort of the humanity of our judges, as well as the so I suppose it's a sort of almost a stick and carrot. It's not just a kind of critique, but also a sort of recognition that there's a sort of support there, which then allows sort of, or in theory, whether it actually works, I don't know, but it allows them space to admit.
And also, just going back to the Feminist Judgments Project, one of the interesting things about that whole exercise is that people are still working within a framework of justice. They're delivering justice, but in some instances it's justice that's almost unrecognisable, but it has all the same trappings of justice. So it's unremarkable, which is quite staggering. As you were talking there, I was just thinking, when I started to teach company law, the first thing I read to the students was an extract from the Communist Manifesto. And I'm sure that's not the common part of company law curriculum, but I was sitting above the students, metaphorically. They heard it coming from me. They hadn't studied company law before, and I'm not sure that they knew that it was exceptional. So it probably was. And so
sounds it.
there are ways of doing it. Okay, well, thank you very much for your fantastic responses, and we could talk for a lot longer
Definitely,
in
no,
response to
absolutely.
this, but I want to open it up to you, if you have questions, comments. If you'd like to put your hand up, we'll go with that. Carl.
Thank you for a really interesting discussion, which actually I have so many questions going through my mind. But one thing that's striking is this reticence, more than reticence, it's an unwillingness to accept the judiciary as institutionally racist, or the judicial system as institutionally racist. And what struck me is, on the one hand, I thought, well, I suppose we cling to the idea that the judiciary is unbiased, because otherwise it's almost like the mask is will drop. On the other hand, we've been through a few years where loads of commentators and to some extent politicians have been constantly saying the judiciary is biased, that they're all biased against Brexit, that they're not neutral. So it's quite selective as to when claims of bias are articulated and when they're seen as entirely inappropriate.
No, well, I agree with that. I'm not sure we can use the B word anymore. But what would be refreshing in those instances is for there to be a response that accepts there is bias, but it's there, it's understood, it's recognised. There's potentially some balance in the adversarial system if we're talking about. A lot of the decisions that are made, and that if an expression comes out, then there are advocates there to do something about it. But if we're honest, we have a greater chance of getting some justice over that particular debate.
And just, if I can follow up, the other way in which bias gets articulated, not just in this country, but elsewhere, is that judges who do not come from kind of dominant categories are often accused of acting in a biased fashion, because that somehow they cannot be objective, because objectivity becomes defined in terms of whiteness or maleness or whatever. And I think of American judiciary, where it's never, where the assumption is that a judge who's a woman of color must be biased, but the white man on the Supreme Court somehow isn't.
Yeah, and that's true. There's any number of cases we can point to where women judges and but also often women judges of colour are criticised as biased. One example is of Bertha Wilson, who was the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada, who just sort of gently asked a question about whether women judges on the court would make a difference, and all of a sudden there was a huge campaign to get her removed, because simply asking that question was something that obviously was a manifestation of bias. Now that didn't happen, but this is one of the consequences, and I think it goes to Keir's point about it. Then it's understandable that the people, when becoming a judge, don't want to articulate that. They assume the mantle of judges, assume this sort of garb of neutrality and objectivity, even whilst recognising that it might not be true or real or even helpful. That was years ago. I wrote about women judges being like the little mermaids. they sort of sold their voice when they joined the bench. And there's now many examples of women judges who aren't like the Little Mermaid, but the kind of the analogy kind of felt true, particularly around in the early days of women judges on the bench, in terms of how they were able, and I wasn't saying that they were, but I was saying they were cast as an outsider by the dominant by the rest of the judiciary.
Thank you very much. Can we say that here in Britain, men judges have a better life than women? I said that, for example, in my country, in Spain, is clearly the High Commission for the Judiciary Control annually publish an inform about containing many items. And one of them is the licenses that judges are enjoying. And you can see that women only have short licenses, very short licenses, and men are having the great figures of licenses, and these figures are increasing as the position are better. So they are more 80–90%, for example, in position in the European Union, Brussels, Strasbourg, so far. Women are usually standing because it's supposed that the duties of conciliation are more focused on women. And so it's not only about comfort, but as well and the progression on the career. Because if you can enjoy higher places, so you can make a better career. I don't know if we can say clearly, in Spain we can say clearly, men have better life than women in judicial. I don't know if we can say clearly here in Britain.
So I don't think we have the same
Yeah.
sort of same metrics that you're referring to there. So I don't think I would be able to say that. What I think we can say something about progression through the judiciary and the ability to progress and the likelihood of career advancements and that I think we might say that white men might be understandably more confident of their ability to, their likelihood to progress than others. So I think there is something there there in terms of sort of how the knowing that you can continue, you will be able to continue on. But that's an interesting metric that you're referring to.
Yes, are very clear figures.
Yeah.
Yes, very clear.
Well, I suppose there's an element of that in the 22 statistics about where judicial appointments, the career pathway of those who are appointed to the judiciary. So white barristers, female barristers, male barristers do much better in terms of getting into the higher judicial offices. And if there's a table which looks at the professional and gender and race composition of the judiciary, and as you go lower down the hierarchy, women enter in larger numbers, solicitors enter in larger numbers, even though it's still not small. So that suggests that at certain points in the judiciary, social and cultural capital begins to shift, and those who are otherwise excluded from the elite purse can have a career, but it's at the bottom of the pile. And as we know, there's not a career judiciary, and there have been talks about how this might be used to shift the balance of distribution in the judiciary, but it's not going to happen anytime soon.
But there's a difference between sort of having a career judiciary in terms of the sort of civil understanding of joining the judiciary young, but this case report talks about a unified judiciary and sort of recognising, and that's something the Baroness Neuberger recommended back in 2010, was sort of say that this is, if we had, and this goes to, I think one of my answers was going to be to the final question around the sort of appointment system. It was like, it's not, for me, another solution is about career progression and having the unified judiciary and people being able to join at a lower level where we know that women and other underrepresented candidates can get in, but actually having a realistic chance of making it into the senior judiciary, which also then requires, which is something that Justice have recommended, but others have recommended before justice, which is an effective system of appraisal and recognising that, you know, that we look to see what judges are doing. And I think that is important. I think that might then allow people making appointments to feel that they can, quote unquote, make riskier appointments, you know, because there's a ability, you know, I'm not suggesting that they are risky appointments, but the perception that people are risky appointments. So actually it's a much more looking at the job, and again it goes back to recognising that these are just part of jobs, you know, that there are many jobs where people are appraised as they go through. There are many jobs which have an effective career path. This isn't unique, and just like back in 2006, the idea that judges might apply for a job was a new thing.
You might get tapped on the shoulder.
Yeah, absolutely. But this idea that we might then see how we're doing when we're in a job is something which, you know, many of us experience. And so I think, I think that sort of is important and an important way. I think often when we think about appointments, that our immediate place is to go to first appointment into the judiciary rather than thinking about sort of promotion as part of the appointment.
Yeah. We've got two people with hands up, so perhaps we'll take those both together and then we'll retire, and if you can both stay for a while, we can have more conversation with refreshments. So, David here at the back.
Thank you, Les. Thank you very much for really interesting conversations. I'm struck, knowing a bit about your research, that the problem of the judiciary and diversity isn't just a problem about the judiciary, and so that valuable and important though your work is, I'm just struck by the way in which the problems that you've admirably highlighted are true throughout legal culture and throughout the legal profession and legal education. And unless we take a more holistic approach, bringing them together and reflecting on why this problem with diversity is a problem, we're not going to make much progress. It's clearly bottom up and top down. It's self-reproducing. Autopoietic theorists would have a field day looking at this. It's about control and power over admission of who makes it, with those important badges of private education being white, male, Oxbridge, very important non-law degree, the cultural notions of the gentleman and what goes with that, of Englishness, those classic dualisms within legal culture like formal and substantive justice, meaning that we need to reconfigure legal professionalism so that, for example, anti-racism is a core feature within legal, our notions of legal professionalism. In addition to a holistic approach, the other thing that seems to me so terribly important is providing evidence that diversity produces better decisions. And there is quite a lot of evidence, not only in terms of the legal profession, not only in terms of the judiciary, but beyond that. I've been involved in some work on women on corporate boards, and it was quite clear from the comparative evidence that you simply get better decision making from a more diverse board of directors, particularly when you're bringing in women. So it seems to me a more holistic approach, and mustering that evidence to prove that diversity really does produce better decision making are ways of progressing this matter.
Thank you, Debbie.
Well, my comment actually builds quite nicely on David's, which is, I think that this is an enormously complex problem, and it doesn't avail itself of an easy solution. But what I would suggest, I suppose, as an educated Martian who has spent several decades of her life here, is that this is the end product of a deeply unequal society, something that hasn't been touched on, but I think intersects with both women and with race in this, is class. And so in any system where if you're conditioned in this country to follow white men, ideally with a suit and with a certain accent. And that's the end product of, it starts at the very beginning at education. And I think one of the problems becomes, it's the point you made, well, we have one woman on the Supreme Court, you know, and that's fine. And it has to do with this, I think, you know, viewing people as your equals. And that starts with children. But that's very hard to come by in this country, actually.
Yeah, I
Nodding sagely, yeah.
the Marshal at the back and David at the front. What you'd find actually in terms of diversity bringing about better decision making, I imagine everybody would agree with that. But again, sounds a bit repetitive, but it's going to be even better if there's a recognition that it's in the context of institutional racism, because I suspect if that was your starting point, you might venture into some other areas in terms of solutions that you wouldn't even have begun to consider because you're operating in this rather restricted space. So I'd like to try and bring it right back to the beginning in terms of this idea of the better decisions in diversity, that there has to be a recognition within which the judiciary are operating. Class, absolutely. Massive problem, especially as we talked about a little about how courts are organised, how the system works, and well, that's for discussion with the refreshments.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your questions and contributions. And I'd just like to finish the formal stage of the proceedings by thanking both Erica and Keir for coming tonight, giving the time, generously giving the time to have this debate. And I hope you'll agree with me that it's an incredibly important debate. It connects with all sorts of issues that have been discussed from time to time, but I think there's an urgency still to have individual debates about particular types of prejudice, but also to acknowledge and recognise the synergies and the potential for the conversation to generate new insights and to share experiences and share approaches. So I think it's been an invaluable conversation, and I thank Keir and his colleagues at Manchester University for producing this incredibly important report and for coming here to bring it to us to have a conversation with Erica and all of you. Thank you very much. It was fantastic.